So the Olympics kick off in just a few weeks. One of the highlight moments for Team USA came in the year 2000. Sprinter Marion Jones dominated. So dominant was she that she was labeled by many the fastest woman in the world. So dominant was she, however, that people began to question whether her performance was even possible. And they began to speculate that she must have been using some type of performance-enhancing drug to be able to run as fast as she did. She adamantly denied taking anything, even though she was associated with known dealers and users. In fact, the questioning picked up to the level where federal investigators got involved and she was placed under oath. And under oath, she denied ever having used anything illegal. Of course, her denials eventually got debunked, and it was revealed that she'd used this new designer steroid called the Clear. And so she won a gold medal, but her prize was a 6-month stint in prison. We don't take too kindly to people who lie, especially under oath. And that brings us to Peter. While not technically under oath, he lied and denied Jesus Christ. And so we're in John 18. In this middle section of John 18, the camera kind of zooms in to focus on Peter. The story shifts back and forth from Jesus standing before the high priest to Peter standing in front of a fire. And the story means for us to examine Jesus, the faithful witness, in contrast to Peter, the unfaithful witness. Here's your main point. Jesus, the faithful witness, overcomes our unfaithfulness. While the structure of the narrative highlights the Peter and Jesus contrast, there are actually 3 major characters that appear in the story. And so we're going to tell the story this morning from the perspective of all 3 major characters. So we've already mentioned Jesus and Peter. The third major character is really kind of a conglomeration of the high priest and his family. We'll just call that the high priest character. And what we're going to see is that there are 2 characters who represent being an unfaithful witness, and then Jesus stands in contrast to them, offers hope for them. So let's read the story first, and then we'll see how Jesus functions as the faithful witness, starting in John 18, verse 12. And then the company of soldiers, the commander, and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus and tied him up. First, they led him to Annas, since he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it would be better for one man to die for the people. Simon Peter was following Jesus, as was another disciple. That disciple was an acquaintance of the high priest, so he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter remained standing outside by the door. So the other disciple, the one known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the girl who was the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. And then the servant girl, who was the doorkeeper, said to Peter, "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" "I am not," he said. Now the servants and the officials had made a charcoal fire because it was cold. They were standing there warming themselves, and Peter was standing with them, warming himself. The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. "I've spoken openly to the world," Jesus answered him. "I've always taught in the synagogue and in the temple where all the Jews gather, and I haven't spoken anything in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who heard what I told them. Look, they know what I said." When he had said these things, one of the officials standing by slapped Jesus, saying, "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" "If I have spoken wrongly," Jesus answered him, "give evidence about the wrong. But if rightly, why did you hit me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. They said to him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He said, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, said, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" And Peter denied it again. Immediately, a rooster crowed. So let's talk about these characters. The first character or group of characters that I want to talk about is the high priest and those associated with him. And we can characterize their response to Jesus as discarding Jesus. And they did that because of self-promotion. John reminds us here towards the beginning of this section of the story that Caiaphas was a self-promoter. He was the one who said, hey, it's better off if we kill one guy than that Rome get whiff of a possible brewing insurrection. Rome was very cautious if any of its territories would rise up in rebellion, and they would crush such rebellion harshly, fiercely, violently, destroying everything. And Caiaphas wanted no part of Rome coming in and reducing Israel to rubble. And I think the reason why is that Caiaphas himself was in a pretty good place. Caiaphas was rich and respected. He was powerful, positioned to influence Pilate, the Roman governor. Caiaphas wasn't in a risk-taking mood. And honestly, from a human perspective, this kind of worked for Caiaphas. Caiaphas was a long-serving high priest. He served in this role for over 20 years. And with the given instability of Roman politics, I mean, you got to understand, Roman politics, they had 3 emperors who served in 1 year because 2 of them got assassinated. I mean, this wasn't a great job security type of role. And Caiaphas managed to get Rome to approve him to stay in this position for decades. He knew how to play the political game. But what we see is he played the political game at the expense of what would please God. Of course, you might be asking the question, okay, so if Caiaphas is the high priest, why did it say that they took Jesus to Annas? Who's Annas? Well, Annas was kind of like the high priest emeritus. He had been high priest before Caiaphas. He was actually Caiaphas's father-in-law, and he served from 6 to 15 AD before Rome got tired of him and booted him out of the position. But if you look in the Old Testament scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures say that when a high priest is appointed, he's to serve as high priest for life. And so the Jewish people respected Annas as the one who should still be the high priest, even though technically he wasn't the high priest, because according to their law and their religious tradition, he should have been the high priest. And so Annas used that respect from the people to leverage power and position and authority for himself. So he was kind of like the power behind the power. So I want you to picture Annas kind of like the Godfather or Tony Soprano. I mean, he was the head of this crime family, which unfortunately is what the high priest family really was. In fact, after Caiaphas, Annas' son-in-law, was high priest, the next 5 high priests were all Annas' actual sons. So they kind of had a family racket going on, even though Rome had to approve their appointment as high priest. More importantly, Annas used his position as high priest to expand his own bank account. Annas was in charge of the selling of animals at the temple. So if you came to the temple and you needed sheep, a dove, a goat, something to sacrifice, he had tables set up where you could buy these animals. You could imagine how corrupt this probably got. Can you imagine some rural Jewish family that picks the firstborn from their flock and they bring it to the temple, and the people on Annas' payroll examine it and they're like, sorry about that, dude. Look at the hooves here. Like, Scripture says no defiled animal, and this animal unfortunately doesn't pass muster. But good news for you, we actually have some pre-approved animals for sale over at our sheep station. In fact, we're selling them 2 for 1 today. So why don't you just open your account with us and, you can get 10% off this. You see how this can work? And so Annas was ultra corrupt. This was ultra not God's will, but it was making him ultra rich. Of course, it made Jesus ultra mad. Remember when Jesus showed up and saw them selling these animals in the temple? What did he do? He flipped over their tables. He said, I want none of that. Okay, so now maybe this story's starting to have some color for you. They took Jesus to Annas because he was the power behind the power. But why was Annas so eager to denounce Jesus to death? Because he wanted to safeguard his temple sheep industry from Jesus, this popular prophet who was calling him to stop taking advantage of people. In fact, so eager was Annas to keep profiting from sheep are us that he was willing to condemn the actual Lamb of God to death. Now, it's interesting that this whole trial was a sham. The Jews had their scriptures written out in Hebrew, but then they wrote some commentary on their scriptures, some books that gave them ideas about how to interpret and apply the scriptures. And we know those books as the Jewish Mishnah. And these books actually give interpretation and application about how Jewish trials are to be conducted. And it's fascinating to note that Annas broke about every rule on how to have a fair trial with how he treated Jesus. So it's interesting that John tells us that they were warming themselves around the fire because it was night. Now, I've said a few times that John doesn't waste details in his gospel. He's not telling us that it's night just because he wants us to have the chronological setting. He's telling us it's night because there was a rule in the Jewish Mishnah, or the Jewish law book, that said trials couldn't be conducted at night. But so eager was Annas to condemn Jesus that he went ahead and had the trial anyway. The high priest was not allowed to question witnesses, but we see here in the text in verse 19 that the high priest is questioning Jesus. A defendant couldn't be forced to speak, same as our Fifth Amendment rights, and yet they were attempting to force Jesus to speak. The proper procedure for a Jewish trial is that first, witnesses would be called who would defend the accused, and then the prosecution would be able to present their witnesses. But notice that no witnesses were called to defend Jesus. The proper procedure when both sides rested their case after all the witnesses had been heard was for the Sanhedrin court to go into recess. They were required to take at least 24 hours to ponder the testimony that they just heard. In fact, they had a rule on their books that they were supposed to meet up with one other person. And so in pairs of two, they were to share a meal and discuss the case that they just heard before they came back to render a verdict. And when the verdict was given, when they would vote on the verdict, they would vote youngest to oldest, because it was such a patriarchal society that younger men would defer to the judgment of their elders. And so in order to make sure that they actually are voting their own conscience and not just going along with those older than them, they would vote youngest to oldest. Notice how all of that was violated here in this trial. There was no waiting period. There was no vote. There were no witnesses. The only witnesses that we see called in other gospels were lying. But here's the thing. And maybe you can relate to the high priest. When we decide we're going to discard Jesus because we want to do our own thing, I want to be rich. I want to be well known. I want to experience pleasure. I just want what I want. We stop caring about the rules. We stop caring about how we get there. We just go for it. And we see that Annas is doing exactly that. In fact, verse 19 kind of clues us into his strategy. He was trying to set Jesus up for a charge based on Deuteronomy chapter 13. So here's what it says in Deuteronomy 13, verses 6-9. If your brother, the son of your mother, or your son or daughter, or the wife you embrace, or your closest friend, secretly entices you, saying, let's go and worship other gods, which neither you nor your ancestors have known, any of the gods of the people around you, near you or far from you, from one end of the earth to the other, do not yield to him or listen to him. Show him no pity, and do not spare him or shield him. Instead, you must kill him. Your hand is to be the first against him to put him to death, and then the hands of all the people. So, what was Annas trying to accuse Jesus of? The phrase in there was key, secretly entice. He was saying, Jesus, you're secretly enticing your disciples to stop worshiping God. You're speaking against the temple, the other gospels would say. Now, this is exactly what a self-promoter who has a financial stake in the temple, especially the temple continuing to sell product, would say. Jesus, you're telling people not to do the temple thing, but we need the temple thing. What's he thinking? I need the temple thing because profits were up 36% this year. Secretly entice. That was the charge. Notice how Jesus answered him. Jesus says, I've taught openly. I love what he said. He said, go get the security footage from the temple. Roll back the video. Listen to what I said. Of course, some of you are chuckling because obviously they didn't have that, but what they had were witnesses who had heard Jesus speak in the temple. Jesus says, go grab the witnesses, check the transcripts, ask them what I said. He said, I didn't say one word to my disciples that I didn't say in the temple. Everything I said privately, I said publicly. My message was clear and open to everyone who asked. So he might have given some additional detail, some additional insight to his disciples, but the main thrust of his message was open and it was available and it was shared with everyone. Here's what's fascinating. John writes his entire gospel with a trial motif. If you read the Gospel of John straight through, it feels like Jesus is constantly being asked to defend himself. Who are you? Where'd you come from? What are you teaching? And the reason why is because John is writing in this trial because his gospel is meant to be the fair trial that Jesus was denied by the corrupt Jewish religious establishment. And those who would render the verdict about Jesus were not those who had already unjustly condemned Jesus, but you and me and all of us. We're the ones who have to render the true verdict about who Jesus is. So it's interesting. Jesus says, go ask the witnesses. What he's really asking for is a fair trial. Of course, that seems to come across disrespectfully to the people who are gathered at night, rushing to judgment against Jesus. And so Jesus gets slapped. In fact, the Greek word there implies just this open-handed strike across the face. Why? I think the idea was that Jesus had violated Exodus 22, verse 28. You must not blaspheme God or curse a leader among your people. Now, Jesus didn't actually curse Annas, and Annas wasn't actually technically a leader. He wasn't the official high priest. He was just assuming the role of that high priest. But you can just imagine the emotionally driven nature of this gathering when they're at Annas' home, this guy who had all this power and influence behind the scenes. And so this Paul Blart Mall cop who wanted to curry influence with Annas is just like, okay, Jesus, you want to say something that comes across a little disrespectful? Bam. Here's the irony. The true high priest was the one struck and the one discarded to die. Once again, he asks for the evidence. He says, if you don't have any real evidence against me, why are you hitting me? Of course, the answer was, we're hitting you because we want to. We're doing what we want to. We're promoting ourselves at the expense of you. There's a word there for us who would promote ourselves at the expense of Jesus. So the high priests and that whole group, they were discarding Jesus because of self-promotion. Peter was a little bit differently. Let's say Peter was denying Jesus because of self-protection. And so the story scene shifts from inside to outside. And so here's Peter standing around a fire. Now, the details are interesting. It says he's standing around a fire with these people that were connected to the high priest. who are these people? They're the people who just arrested Jesus in the garden. Isn't that an awkward position for Peter to be in? They had just come to arrest Jesus and he was on the other side. So you can picture Peter kind of standing there trying to warm up by the fire, but also maybe trying to hide his face so the light of the fire doesn't reveal who he was. I mean, not only were they on different sides of the arrest in the garden, but think about what had just happened in the garden, what Peter had just done. Like, here are all these soldiers, and they were the co-workers of this guy that Peter had just de-eared. De-eared, uneared. I'm not quite sure the technical term there, but here's the thing. Peter's in a tricky spot. Jesus had been unjustly arrested. He was facing an unjust trial. But Peter had earned a charge. I mean, I'm thinking that Peter could be charged with first-degree assault with a deadly weapon or even attempted murder. Now, to his credit, Peter did follow Jesus like he claimed that he would at the Last Supper. Remember Peter's bold, brash claim, "I'll follow you wherever you go." Well, he was like 1-for-1 for now. He follows Jesus. Of course, he can't get in the door to where Jesus is because there's a doorkeeper who's probably like a 13-year-old girl. And she's like, "I need your credentials." He's like, "I have no credentials." But then it says that this other guy vouched for him. It said this other disciple who was known to the high priest. And you might be wondering, who is this other disciple and why isn't he named? Well, it's likely that this other disciple was John, and as was his practice, John doesn't refer to himself by name in his own gospel. But we have two reasons for thinking it was John. The first reason is that the term other disciple and the term the disciple Jesus loved appear together in John chapter 20 and verse 2, when Peter and this other disciple, the one Jesus loved, were running to examine Jesus's empty tomb. And so since we're pretty sure that John was the disciple Jesus loved, we can kind of put the pieces together and assume that John was the same disciple who showed up at the high priest's courtyard here in John 18. The other reason says that he was known to the high priest. Now, what do we know? John had a brother named James. They were called to be Jesus's disciples together, and Jesus called them to leave the family fishing business. But they had a dad who probably owned the fishing business named Zebedee. And there's an interesting note in the Gospel of Mark that says that Zebedee actually had servants. Now, here's the thing about having servants. You actually have to have some money to have servants. I don't think a lot of people who did local fishing to kind of sell it on the dock each morning had servants. But maybe you could think about like Zebedee's fish stick empire. And here's a dude who's got some actual funds and will probably qualified to hobnob with high society. And so if he owned servants, it wouldn't be unthinkable that he would hang out with the high priest and other people of high social status. And so Zebedee's son would be known to the high priest and would be able to enter into his courtyard. So that's probably who it was and why it was, but what really matters to the story is just that John got in. So John gets in, but Peter gets in, but Peter doesn't get in without getting questioned. And so this teenage girl at the door questions him. And it's interesting, the question is phrased in English the same way it is in Greek. It's kind of expecting a negative answer, right? "You aren't one of his disciples, are you?" Well, it was pretty easy for him to say, no, just kind of go with it. Like, question was expecting a negative answer. He just gives the negative answer. Here's the thing, though. I want you to notice that Peter denies Jesus 3 times, but each time he's asked, it escalates in severity of the person asking him. Like the drama is building. See, here's the thing about this doorkeeper. 13-year-old girl, probably not rich, probably not well connected, probably couldn't take Peter in a fight if he decided that he was going to try and get away from her. And she couldn't condemn him because women in that era weren't allowed to testify in court. Certainly not a poor teenage girl. But Peter's jumpy. He's on edge. He's scared. And Peter's going to do what he needs to do to protect himself. He won't even admit his identity to the most harmless person he encounters. Now, it's interesting. I told you the story kind of shifts between Jesus inside and Peter outside. Look back to what Jesus says in verse 20 and 21. He's like, I haven't spoken in secret. If you want to know what I said, go ask the witnesses. They'll tell you. You know who the best person around was to tell who and what Jesus had done? Peter. His best position to be a witness. But he's got nothing to say. How ironic. Jesus is like, my people will vouch for me. And Peter's like, nope, sure won't. He'd gone into full self-protection mode. So the dramatic tension escalates in verses 25 and 26. Next, it just says, they said to him. Who's they? These soldiers. Now, the soldiers were probably hanging around because Annas and Caiaphas would have lived in the same family compound. Like the high priest had this like big family castle almost where they all lived. And so their houses were probably like 25 feet apart. So when it says that Annas sent Jesus to Caiaphas, it was like he shuffled him down the hall. But the soldiers were hanging out because they figured that eventually they were going to send him to someone else, which we know is what happened. So the soldiers knew that their transporting services might be again required. And so here they are hanging out by the fire. And these soldiers, they had been knocked to their feet by Jesus, but they were powerful enough that they were able to actually arrest Jesus. And Peter didn't have the supernatural angelic powers at his disposal that Jesus did. So when they asked him, are you one of his disciples? That question carried some weight. And then the third question from one of the specific soldiers. Says one of the relatives of the man Peter had Mike Tyson'd. Well, you can imagine what's going on in Peter's mind. If I admit knowing him, they're going to put the pieces together. He's like, didn't I see you in the garden? And Peter's like, no. You didn't see my knife. You didn't see that slash. Peter's doing everything he could to protect himself. It's interesting. All the other gospels give us Peter's emotional response after he denies Jesus and the rooster crows, not here in John. Here in John, it just says, Jesus was proven right. Peter denied. The rooster crows. And Peter's left to deal with his own failure. Now, lest we be too harsh on Peter, can I just say, I don't think Peter went into this expecting to fail. I don't think he wanted to fail. I think he had all the intention in the world of standing for Jesus Christ. You know what happened? The clutch moment came and Peter flopped. He couldn't come through in the moment that mattered because he wasn't ready. His heart wasn't in a place where he valued Jesus more than his own life. It's interesting, though, how the early church responded so much differently and so much better than Peter did. There was a Roman official named Pliny the Elder. He was in charge of a Roman province in about 111 AD. So this is, 80 years after Peter's denial of Jesus, give or take. But Pliny had people that identified as Christians drug before him. And they were charged with sedition from Rome because they were worshiping Jesus instead of the Roman gods and the Roman emperor. And so Pliny wrote a letter to a man named Trajan, who was the emperor of all of Rome at the time. And he was like, I just want to tell you what I've been doing with these Christians. I want you to sign off that my procedure is acceptable. Here's what he wrote. In the case of those denounced to me as Christians, I followed the following procedure. I interrogated them as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, and he doesn't mean like said we're sorry for claiming to be Christians. He means they confessed as in, I confess that I'm a Christian. Those who confess, I interrogated a second and third time, threatening them with punishment. And that isn't like I'm going to send you to your room without supper. Like when a Roman governing official threatens to punish you, he means I'm going to take off your head. It's like I threatened them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. You know what we take away from that? There were Christians 80 years after Peter who were asked once, twice, and then a third time, will you deny Jesus? And they went to their grave because they wouldn't deny their Lord. Something changed between Peter and the early church. These martyrs did what Peter couldn't. Fear sabotages faith. In fact, if you slink back from talking about Jesus before your friends or your family or those who might ask you, the words Jesus said might ring in your ears. Here's what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, verses 32 and 33. Therefore, everyone who will acknowledge me before others, I will also acknowledge him before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before others, I will also deny him before my Father in heaven. Jesus was a traveling preacher. I don't think he came up with different sermons every time he spoke. I think he spoke the same general messages at every different town. And so those who traveled with him, his disciples like Peter, had probably heard those words over and over and over and over and over again. So when Peter was standing before the fire and he was denying Jesus, I wonder if those words from Jesus were rattling around in the back of his mind. Peter copped out because he was a coward. And the Bible doesn't have many nice things to say about cowards. In fact, here's what John himself would write in Revelation chapter 21. But the cowards, notice first in the list of all these sins, but the cowards, their share will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. Those who deny deserve to die. Those who are not connected with Jesus have no share in the victory Jesus would win on the cross. That's the bad news. But there's good news. The reason things changed between 33 AD and 111 AD is because transformation happened, because restoration happened, because those who were unfaithful could be made faithful, because Jesus became the faithful one to erase our unfaithfulness. Jesus substituted his faithfulness in place of our unfaithfulness, which leads us to our third character. Instead of self-promotion that discards Jesus or self-protection that denies Jesus, we see self-sacrifice, a curse-bearing Jesus. So Jesus is struck across the head, accused of cursing the high priest. But here's the irony. Jesus was the true high priest, and he was the one who would wear the curse. Jesus would bear the curse in our place. Here's what Galatians chapter 3, verse 13 says. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, because it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree. Jesus went to the tree to be cursed, to take the death curse that should have hung over you and over me. See, we can identify with the high priest and the self-promotion, or with Peter and the self-protection, with the discarding and the denial. We can think of things in our life, times when we've rejected Jesus, where we've turned from him, where we've wanted nothing to do with him. We've denied ever even knowing him because we wanted to please ourselves and do our own thing. And because of our rebellion against God and our rejection of him, we should have worn the curse. But here's what 2 Corinthians 5:21 says. God made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. The curse we earned, Jesus carried in our place to the cross. Why did he do that? He did that so that he could redeem and restore broken sinners like Peter. There's a detail in the text that I don't want you to miss. Look back into the text here when it talks about the fire. Verse 18 says that they'd made a charcoal fire. That seems like a throwaway line. Like, who cares? It was made out of charcoal. It could have been made out of wood. It could have, I don't know what else they could have made it out of. They could have made it out of branches, leaves. I mean, lots of stuff they could have burned, right? But they used charcoal. Okay. Why does that matter? You need to look ahead to John 21 and verse 9. And in John 21 verse 9, it says that there was a charcoal fire with fish on it. And well, it's not what was on the fire, it's what the fire represents. That fire was the place where Jesus came to have breakfast with his disciples after he'd risen from the dead. And he didn't show up because he was hungry and wanted to eat fish. He showed up because Peter was going to be there. And he showed up because he had work for Peter still to do. But before Peter could do the work, Jesus needed to heal Peter of his denial. Before Peter could stand for Jesus, he needed to be transformed by Jesus. And so Jesus shows up to have a conversation with Peter where he'll bring him back into the fold. And he shows up at the same place where Peter failed. He returns to the site of the offense, a charcoal fire, and at another charcoal fire, he restores him. What a powerful thing this was for Peter, standing around this fire, as Jesus said once, and then twice, and then 3 times, "Do you love me?" He was purging Peter of his failure and restoring him because Peter didn't need to wear the curse any longer. Jesus had taken it for him. Peter didn't need to be marked as a coward any longer because Jesus had transformed him from cowardly denier to the one who would testify and share the gospel with 3,000 people just a few days later. Jesus is in the restoration business. We've all sinned and deserve to wear a curse. The question is, who wears the curse? You know, I wanted to end with a story. So interesting. Peter's failure kind of centered around this knife that he pulled out. It reminds me of a story from 10 or so years ago in my own ministry. It was the week before Easter. I got a call late at night. I'd been doing premarital counseling with a young couple. I got a call from this young lady and she's like, "My whole world's just falling apart." Okay, what's going on? She's like, "My fiance's in jail. He just robbed a cash advance store with a knife." Why'd he do that? Well, it turns out he's been addicted to heroin for years and nobody knew. And he was running low on money and he thought he could get money by robbing this store. He made it like a block before he was arrested, put in jail, and charged with a 2nd-degree felony, armed robbery, facing something like 10 to 20 years in prison. And none of the family could see him, but a lot of county jails will let clergy go in and visit. And so I used my clergy pass, and a day or 2 later, I was in there talking to him. And so I looked at this young man who I'd been getting to know and realized I didn't know much about him at all. And I yelled at him in the most loving way possible. And I just said, "Choose this day who you're going to serve." Like, you know who Jesus is, you know the gospel, but you've been choosing to discard him and to deny him because you wanted to live for yourself. Like, are you going to turn around and live for Christ or are you not? Like, this is your choice. This is the moment in which you must choose. And so this dude sitting in Preble County Jail in Ohio, tears just streaming down his face, repents. And he had 6 months before he went to trial. And he sat in that county jail, and I was allowed to bring books to him. He starts reading John Piper books in jail. He's like reading Desiring God and Future Grace, and he's motoring through these books. Like I can't get him to him fast enough. So finally I bring him Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology, which if you don't know is like this big. And so he's like just like studying systematic theology before he has to go stand in front of the judge. So his trial date finally comes and he pleads guilty. He's like, I'm not going to hide from what I did. And he stands before the judge, and we'd written some letters about the transformation that was happening in his heart. And the judge looks at him and says, according to Ohio state law, the mandatory minimum sentence is, it was like 2 or 3 years. He's like, but I see something here that I haven't seen in a long time. He's like, I'm going to throw out the mandatory minimum. It's like, I'm going to give you a 6-month drug rehab program, and then you're free to go back to your family. And it's been over a decade, and that dude's still walking with Jesus. His life's not perfect, but he still claims the name of Jesus Christ. And I'm like, that is what Jesus does. He takes the curse and he reverses it so that we who deserve punishment and death receive transformation, receive hope in its place. That was the transformation offered to Peter. It's the transformation offered to you and me.